And so
Welcome to Visions, Inc. Visions is an acronym for Vigorous Interventions in Ongoing Natural Settings. Our goal in our work is to help organizations and systems and groups and people learn to recognize, understand, and value differences. We hope this website will help you understand why we think this is important. Growing up in the United States, I'm going to move it around a little bit to this who we are, and we can sort it out, I know later. Growing up in the United States in the 1950s, assimilation is what I was taught is the law of the land. At the same time, in the 1950s, I was living under legalized segregation. So as I became of age and was learning about this notion of the melting pot, and went to town on the weekends and noticed that some of us could go into the front of a store and some of us couldn't, I started to question, what does assimilation mean? At some level, that is part of what motivates my interest in recognizing, understanding, and appreciating differences. It's creating a world in which young people grow up seeing themselves as part of our collective and not as separate from it. Given the history of the United States, such a process takes work. That's what we do at Visions every day. We help people see the ways in which our organizations and our systems and our communities may include some people and exclude others on the basis of many variables. And our work since 1984 has been interrupting those barriers to inclusion of people on the basis of their differences, whatever they may be.
Great, Val. So that's beautiful. It really sounds nice. And I think what I'd like to do is take away the paper so that you look. No, because I think you've got it, and I think we want you to look here all the time so that they don't think you're reading something. Because that was really great. I mean, that's nice. Okay. So if you want to, now having sort of done that, just do either part of that, welcome or history. They're two separate little units. It was fun to watch you. Is it okay for me to watch you here so that you don't look at me away from the camera? Because I really, it's good.
Sure. I'm just thinking about what else to say. Visions began in 1984. And we brought together a group of professionals and community activists and educators and other, I would say, people who work to help other people change. We brought together the groups of folks who were all in their respective areas asking the question, how do we include people who have been historically excluded? At our first retreat in Moulton, Virginia in 1985, we realized that within many disciplines, be that education, law, psychology, health, medicine, religion, and even in the corporate world, there were many similar questions being asked. Different words, different language, but the issue of how do we bring in people who've been historically excluded from historically white or historically male organizations, how do we bring these folks in ways that allows everyone to prosper? This was after the first wave of affirmative action in the United States, in which often the goal was to bring in people, but there was no attention to how do you prepare the workplace, how do you prepare the community, how do you prepare the church. There was also no attention given to what might have to change in the organization to allow for people to stay, to allow for retention. So after the Civil Rights Act in the United States was passed in 1964 and 65 in this century, and this was 84, about 20 years later. And there had been a first wave of people who had not been allowed into workplaces coming in. And there was enough information to say that a revolving door was beginning to happen in many disciplines. So we were interested in what has to happen in order to minimize this reality. And we developed a model that suggests that part of how we do this is to recognize that change in any system occurs at multiple levels. It is not enough just to bring in people, which would be the institutional level where you open your doors so that people can work in your setting, for example. But that it was also important to look at what are the attitudes, feelings that workers have, both the worker who's coming in and the workers who are there, and how does how do those attitudes result in behaviors that might inhibit the success of the new employee. So we looked at the personal and the interpersonal level, as well as the institutional level. And then we also were asking ourselves, as we were looking at the data on why people were not succeeding, we asked ourselves, what has to change in the culture of an organization so that it allows for different ways of doing things. So one of the first projects that Visions did was to work with a major communications network, a corporate business that was bringing in people from China, people from the Caribbean, people from the US, African Americans, white folks. And the organization was forming a new culture. They were breaking up from a bigger organization. They were forming a new culture. And so it was an opportune time to look at what are the cultural norms that have been dominant in our organization historically, and how do we change those. So one of our first projects was to create a workshop that would allow this organization to really see that different employees might work differently and still reach the same goal. So we did we set up various scenarios in which a group of Chinese employees might work together, a group of African diaspora employees might work together, a group of white women, a group of white men. And the task would be the same, and they would approach it in very different ways. And typically they would come to one or two of the same outcomes. And it was a very illuminating in terms of the fact that there's more than one way to solve most problems. And it was also very energizing for the whole team to be able to look at the fact that there was more than one right way. And also it allowed for a lot of challenging of assumptions about how certain groups solve problems and how some groups are better at it than others. So it was a really great way to immerse ourselves early on in how this is true in the corporate context. So that was thought.
Mm-hmm. So if we think about the section about like our theory, if you try to think of people who would sort of be shopping around and wondering how's one theory different from another, mm-hmm. and how are they going to hear about that in almost an advertisement versus a...
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to the 4 levels, because I was thinking about that as one...
and if you use the word our theory, because they're going to be clicking there, you can say, yeah.
When we began the work in 1984, many... let me say it this way. The field of diversity and inclusion has gone through several iterations since the 1960s. And when we first started the work in the 1980s, people were coming out, the field was often called human relations training. And a lot of cities and other municipalities and states were creating human relations commissions. And their goal was to help people learn how to interact differently and to understand their prejudices and their biases. And so the work was largely at the personal and interpersonal level, the idea being if we get to know each other as human beings, we will be less likely to discriminate because we will see all the ways in which we're similar. So again, it was not necessarily challenging the assumption that differences are also important, but it was trying to get at the fact that differences aren't negative. And this is a very important point in the U.S. context, that if if we strive for assimilation, we will have a higher value on the ways that we are alike than the ways in which we're different. So Vision's idea was to suggest that it's not just that we want to eliminate prejudice and we want to have people understand our common humanity. It's also that we want to change the notion that assimilation is the only value that's important, and that the value of recognizing difference, pluralism, also has merit both as a moral issue, but more importantly as a business issue, as an education issue, as a healthcare issue. That, for instance, students who, if we recognize that each child in a classroom may bring a different and unique perspective, we're much more likely to reach all the children in the classroom than if our goal is to have all the children behave in the same way. So we were interested in introducing what we see as a cultural level difference in terms of how we envision our people say our beloved community, how we envision our workplace, how we envision our classroom, so that it's a classroom in which both similarities and differences are promoted. So one of the things that I think Visions brings to the table that is different is a lot of attention to how do we practice both and thinking. How do we both hold our similarities and acknowledge and use our differences? Most organizations are focused on how do you be successful within a system. And we see that success as inherently inhibited to fully transforming the system as long as the focus is on how are we the same. So that's a really important piece of theory that I think is uniquely practiced in the Visions model through our various tools. Another tool that we have is a tool that looks at the subtle, unintentional ways in which barriers to inclusion happen. My graduate school work at Duke University was on a concept called modern racism, which we have adapted to speak to all the ways in which social location can be a barrier for someone to be excluded from a system. And modern isms are the subtle, unintentional ways in which those barriers occur. Modern racism can occur at each of the 4 levels also, so that we could create a hiring practice that was unintentionally exclusive. And in fact, some of these processes we can't actually change. For instance, in the United States, we are still a country that institutionally supports English as the primary language, and there is an expectation that to be successful in most U.S. organizations, you will need to speak English, and English in a certain way.
Val, you have to sit back, because when you lean towards us,
you can't see my face.
It goes out of focus.
Okay. So it's English only. So by definition, when we interview people for a job, we want those people need to speak English. And if they speak English with an accent that is different than the norm, unconsciously we may see them as less qualified for the job. That's an example of a modernism. And it's a subtle reality that we may not be aware of. So modernisms are one of the tools that we think we bring that is unique. We have identified 5 kinds of modernisms that we can practice at each of the 4 levels. And we typically do that, again, outside of awareness. That is, when we don't know what we don't know when we practice these behaviors. The whole notion of not knowing what we don't know is another important tool that we invite our workshop participants to try on. We use the analogy of a fish doesn't know it's in the water to invite people to understand what the water is in their particular organization or setting, and then to look at how water is a metaphor for the rules, practices, and policies of the organization. And then as they begin to name those, to look at how those might get in the way of it being a successful place for folks. So to stay with the notion of English only, I worked with a corporation a few years back where the leadership was all white and English speaking. In this case, it was the English speaking that probably was the biggest barrier. And most of the workers on the line in this manufacturing organization came from Vietnam. And because the leadership didn't understand the language of the employees, they assumed that it was not functional for those folks to speak their language at work. So they made a policy that you could only speak English at work. The motivation and morale of the workers had decreased significantly, and we were called in, and there were increases in perceived feelings of racism and discrimination among the employees that the HR department was having to address. And we were brought in to help them identify what was going on in this situation. At the cultural level, the notion of English only was working against business success. The leadership was not aware of the impact of not allowing their employees to speak their own language when they were speaking with each other. Even on the line, when the line was everyone on the line spoke a different language, except the person who was watching the line. And so it became clear that this strategy was not increasing business efficiency. It was in fact decreasing it, increasing mistakes, lowering productivity, and therefore decreasing the bottom line.
Okay, that's good. Thanks, Val.
Internalized oppression is, so I can talk about it. We have several, I don't know if you want to be linear, we have many tools in our toolkit in Visions. Another important part of the Visions model that I think is has been over the years, we've gotten incredible feedback about the utility of this element, and it is the notion that those who have been historically excluded from a system have also been impacted by the assimilation model, by the notion that monocultural ways of being are better, and that from places where we are historically excluded, we will adapt certain behaviors that initially are survival behaviors, and these behaviors can become learned in ways that they become habitual, and we do them even when they're not necessary. When we practice these behaviors, which we call internalized oppression, and they work to our own disadvantage, then they are no longer survival behaviors and they become dysfunctional. So in our work, we invite everyone to look at what have been the negative consequences to me of a monocultural system. And so from places where I am in a group that may have been historically excluded, I can begin to challenge the survival behaviors, the internalized oppression that I am using, and in so doing, first of all, feel better about myself, feel more empowered within myself, and second of all, perhaps impact the system differently. So in the case of an English-only place, it was because the workers didn't just, culturally it would have been, the culture would say, do as you are told, and the employees resisted that and began, at first individually, to begin to complain about the situation, and in some cases to push back, which led to this intervention that we were doing. Had they not done that, the direction they were going was going to fire these folks and get more folks. So and that then would have been colluding with the system, and therefore personally losing because you lose your job, but also the system would never have been challenged and no one would understand why this was not working.
Great. Thanks, Val. So if you imagine you have caught someone's attention for just a minute or two at a function, which you probably go to a lot of them, trying to figure out, people say, well, what do you do? And you say, I do, or Visions does this, and someone says, well, how's it different from all the other diversity work? Would you be willing to try on speaking as if you literally only have because you do that well with people. You just hit them with like some of your sentences. So
Yeah.
you can either pick the welcome or the history or our theory and just pretend I only have a couple minutes to hear you. Should we pause it, Rick? Doug?
What time is it? 5? Is it 5? It's 5 what?
5:15.
Okay, 5. Yeah, it's like I get that car at 5:30. So I guess I'll just have to call you later. Or are you here in the morning?
I'm doing that thing at the Federal Reserve.
What time is that? What time is it?
That's at 10 o'clock.
You want to pause it?
Yeah, can you? Okay. So I'm talking to this person about what it is that's unique about visions.
Yeah, so let's say I'm someone who's shopping around I run an organization and I'm shopping around. I meet you at an event and I say, yeah, I've been looking, around. And what's unique about visions?
I think the thing there are many things that are unique about visions, and it's hard to speak about that in a short period of time. And I think that one of the first things that comes to mind for me is that we genuinely believe that the most important thing is figuring out what is it that you are attempting to change in your organization. What is it that's not working? And so we come into organizations with the goal of helping them identify what their, as they say these days, pain points are. And we attempt to create an intervention that will address that. And we see this as the outcome of the work is defined by the client on the basis of what it is that they are looking for. So I think that's a unique approach. Many organizations see awareness as the goal of diversity and inclusion work. We see behaving differently as the desirable outcome, and that behaving differently personally and institutionally. So having the system behave differently and having the people behave differently, which leads to a shift in how the culture works. So people who find our work most useful, say that there is a change in how valued employees feel, how creative they feel, how motivated they feel to come to work, they enjoy being there. So that's really, I think, one of the key ways in which we are different, that we're interested in meeting the goal that you have for your change in organizational outcome. Yeah.
That's great. So, Dogo, I want to ask you something, because Val, like me, very relational, like you too, just like being with people. If I'm talking to Val and she's looking at me, are her eyes, if she looks at me, is it going to be good enough in terms of, or is it going to feel like someone she's looking to the side? Because I'd rather just
feel a little bit like that.
Okay, so I got to get closer to this thing.
Because I forget about looking at the camera. Okay.
So if because I do want to just talk with Val. So do you think that's close enough if she looks at me? Look at me, Val, as if we're having a conversation. How's that going to appear for people if we're talking?
Now look at the camera. Yeah, that's pretty good. I don't see much of a difference.
Wait, actually, Val, just look in my eyes, okay? So let's talk about, you need to get your car later? Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it too off to the angle?
I mean, I think it's going to be pretty small.
Yeah, why don't you sit there? If you sit there, or stand there.
I can actually, oh, I guess not with my camera.
Well, I think I can fit. It's a little strange.
I can look at the camera. It's cool.
Yeah, I guess we can talk, if it's not too weird to see me bending.
I'm just worried about your back.
No, I'm good. Okay, Val, so I think having us work in, how's that, Doug, if she looks at me? Having us, just look at me, Val. If you try to do what you just did, which is assume that someone's got a drink and they've got a minute and a half and they're going to go meet someone else who's also running a company, I think that's going to be, you're good at grabbing people that way, and I think we want to shoot for those grabs. How's that?
I think that's good.
Going to be okay? Okay. So, if I asked you, Val, to tell me, I see you at this thing and I say, oh, I've heard something about visions, but what's the history? Where did this thing come from? What's the history of visions?
You want me to go back over what I already said?
Yeah, but try to say it in 2 minutes. Just tell me what you think of as, what story would you tell someone who wants to know, where did visions come from?
We the founders were four. Let me start over.
Yeah, you gotta look at me.
We started in 1984 in Virginia, and North Carolina. Three of us were Southerners, African American women who were grew up in legalized segregation, and were looking for how to create systems that would be inclusive. And one white Jewish man who was also grew up as part of the civil rights struggle from the Northeast. And we were interested in those questions, and we brought together professionals from many walks of life. I don't like to say professionals. We brought together people from many walks of life and many disciplines to ask the question, how do we create systems that empower all people?
Great. And what do you think makes Visions current? Because, it's a long time since the civil rights movement.
Well, there are a couple of things. One is that, as you may or may not know from being in the world this last 30 years, we as a country have been recycling issues of power and oppression and exclusion. And so in many ways, we predicted two of the founders had met in graduate school studying this concept, the concept of modern racism, which is one of our tools. And that concept suggests that the character of racism will change but not disappear as long as we have various kinds of inequities. So in many ways, we've been cycling this problem for the last 30 or 40 years. So it's changed, much has changed, but much has not changed. One of our articles is called Modern Racism, New Melody for the Same Old Tunes. So in that sense, I think that what we have to say is very current. It is also the case that in 2003, we began to actively look at how are these issues different for young people, and we developed a youth version of our model. And we think that's another way that we stay current, is that we are very much engaged with young people between the ages of 15 and 30, young people and young adults who are navigating in this world and who help us understand and stay fresh around how these issues are similar and different now than then.
Great. Okay, so I hear you talking about race. Where I'm from, we have other kinds of challenges. So does Visions, can Visions help me, given that it's not necessarily race in the area I'm in? There's other issues.
Yeah. Yes. So this would be, as I was talking about English only before. So are you a new person? You're not the same person. Right? I haven't really talked much about race at all today. Since the very beginning, it was clear to us that as in the words of Andre Lord, there is no hierarchy of oppression. That the issue of inclusion and exclusion exists for many of us, all of us in some way. That the history of the United States is a history of in and out groups. And so race is one variable, and there are many, many variables, and all of them are important. And part of the pain of this problem is that we have trouble as a society, I think, holding that complexity. And so we want to make it simple, and we want to think that if a person is talking about one thing, they might not care about something else. And we care about all of them. And we know that, how do you say that a black Jewish lesbian is just black? It's just about race. I mean, it's about many different things. So we think that that's part of the trap of either or thinking, and that part of changing these dynamics is changing that thinking. So we encourage our consultants to practice inviting folks to start with where they experience of oppression or exclusion, whatever that is. And so whatever the facilitator may be speaking about, or whatever their employee may be speaking about, there is a way to empathize, which they can learn about through exploring themselves as a social being. In fact, I think one of the biggest challenges in the West another cultural level challenge is that we think about ourselves, we're taught to think of ourselves as individuals. And so as particularly in places where we have privilege, we may not think of ourselves in terms of a group even. So another piece about unlearning these this exclusion and lack of diversity is to recognize that group reality is real, just like individual reality is real. And I think that's one of the other cultural level pieces that we invite people to try on. That you're not just an individual, you are also part of social groups. And social groups have differential power. And differential power is what leads to some people being in and some people being out. And so if we can understand the ways in which we are in groups that have power and in some groups that don't have power, then we can begin to see, okay, so from positions where I don't have power, that might be a place where I can empathize with other groups who don't have power. And conversely, in groups where I have power, I can see that I have the option, it feels like normal. So as a Christian, I have the option of practicing my religion every week. Someone who is Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist doesn't necessarily have that option without paying a bigger price. They have to take time off work. They have to endure people wondering, why are you doing that? Why, people whose religion has them pray a certain number of times a day. People look at them like they're strange. They often don't have places to do that. So we have structured into our culture, for instance, Christianity as the dominant religious group, and all other groups are excluded institutionally, and therefore often they're invisible, and we see them as culturally weird, as opposed to thinking about how might we embrace all the religions of the world who reside in the United States. And the model encourages you to look at all of those variables.
Great. So we've done history, we've done theory. So let's try the welcome again, Val, because I think you had the paper the first time. Mm-hmm. If you were just assuming, not that someone is like you and rather read, mm-hmm. assume there's someone who wants to hear someone's voice before they decide to go further, you just try welcoming me to the website as to why I'm shopping around, Yeah.
Welcome to our website, and we appreciate your time. We are excited that you are interested in learning about our vigorous interventions in ongoing natural settings, which is what VISIONS is an acronym for. And we hope you will see in the website something that excites you about pursuing our work further. We believe that this kind of change is lasting when each person sees themselves in it. And it is our hope that as you explore the website, you will see yourself. And that if you don't, you will be willing to contact us and let us know that as a way of engaging as well. Because we really do want to hear from you and want to hear what you like and what you don't like. Because that's how multiculturalism works, is that we get engaged around both the ways in which we agree, the ways in which we disagree. We are willing to try on exploring that as a way for each person to grow.
Nice. That's good, Val.
That's really good.
Yeah, you're zeroing in like a telescope. So, Doug, as you think about it, Val was doing welcome, history, theory. Is there one of those that you think you want to try again that needs to be compressed, or do you think?
How short are you trying to get the whole thing?
Well, each of them, they're separate segments.
Then I think they're all pretty condensed.
Okay. Yeah, because it'll be three separate, probably 1.5 to 2.5 minute
Yeah,
clips.
I think that was good then.
Okay. So Val, we'd like to shoot some stills of you for the website because he can do